I feel like we've turned to you at really fraught moments, not just for the country, but for folks in the building in which you work. And when you first saw the video of the second strike on the shipwreck survivors, I feel like we've all had an education in the laws of war, but it is the textbook example of where the line exists in war. The law of war is that you don't bomb people who are shipwrecked. Do you stand by what you said when you walked out of that briefing, that it was, quote, one of the most disturbing, one of the most troubling things you've seen in your time in public service?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. And, as you may know, apparently my colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee and on the Senate Armed Services Committee were able to see that video today. So you'll have lots of other reactions to it. But, speaking for myself, I've spent years now as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee reviewing our lethal activities. And so this is not a new thing for me to see the United States kill someone. Usually when we do that, you have, just to make up a situation here, you have guys with AK-47s. You know that they are driving somewhere to meet other people in order to try to take down an American airliner, in order to try to fly a plane into a U.S. target. In this instance, this video shows, as has been widely reported, two individuals who are in obvious distress. And look, you can celebrate their distress because you don't like drug dealers, but the law is the law. These are shipwrecked people. And as you pointed out, it's not a textbook example. It is the very example given by Department of Defense regulations as an example of when you can't shoot. And in this video, you watch the United States watch these two individuals for a long period of time and kaboom, obliterate them.
What is your belief about whether or not a war crime was committed?
Well, here we get into an interesting debate, because I don't think that this is a war. And I know it's not a war because Congress hasn't debated it, which, of course, is the whole point of the War Powers Resolution that Ranking Member Meeks and Smith and I are pushing today. And even though the president calls it the biggest armada ever assembled, and even though we're using a good chunk of American combat power, it's a war that is not a war, right? It's a war that is going to use a good chunk of American combat power, but it doesn't require what the Constitution says must happen, which is approval by the Congress of the United States. And people need to grapple with that a little bit. Look, you can be in favor of these activities, as some percentage of the American population is, but at a minimum, the representatives of the people assembled in Congress should be debating things like whether we, in fact, want to start summarily executing. And that you asked whether this is a war crime or not. It's what I saw is either a war crime or it's murder, depending on whether you think we're engaged in a legitimate war here. But my larger point is that all of these things should be debated. For the first time in our history, the military is targeting civilians, not targeting military actors. For the first time, we're getting away from the idea that we should collect intelligence on these people, who their bosses are, where the transshipments point are, and simply blow them up in open ocean. I mean, you can come out in different places on these arguments, but this is precisely what the Founding Fathers would have us debating inside the Congress of the United States, and the Republicans today are saying, no, we don't want to debate that. We want the president to be able to do whatever he wants. That is not what our Founding Fathers intended.
Why do you think they want that? Why? I mean, because it seems that all these things can't be true. People that support the strikes only support them because they think it is how we prevent the flow of illegal drugs into the United States of America. But the vast majority of illegal drugs that flow into the United States of America come through Mexico or China, and they include fentanyl. These are basically cigarette boats with cocaine on them. I mean, why do the Republicans accept something that is false on its face?
Yeah. I mean, there's two reasons why the Republicans are arguing against the Congress debating, them debating this. Number one, of course, they're still, most of them are still doing whatever President Trump tells them to do. So they're not actually representing their constituents. They're just saying, yes, sir, how high, sir, when Donald Trump tells them to do something. But the other point, and this is more interesting, is because if we debated this action, we would ask tough questions like the one you just raised. Are we really stopping the flow of cocaine? By the way, cocaine is not fentanyl in terms of its lethality. Fentanyl is killing roughly twice the number of Americans as cocaine. Are we stopping the flow of cocaine, or are we simply moving it into aircraft or into overland routes into the United States? I suspect I know the answer to that question. They would have to struggle with the fact that right in the middle of these boat strikes, President Trump decided to pardon truly a massive kingpin, the Honduran former president, who said very literally, we're going to shove cocaine up Americans' nose. If we had that debate, they would have to answer for that. And so this is not a debate that they really want to have because they don't have good answers to a lot of the questions that need to be asked.
Let me just share this with our viewers. I'm sure you're already aware of it. The U.S. military assets that have been moved to the region include warships, 15,000 sailors and Marines, patrol aircraft, Reaper drones, the F-35 fighter squadron, 9 aircraft and helicopter squadrons. There are men and women, sons and daughters, moms and dads, brothers and sisters, of families all over this country that have been positioned in the region. Why are they there?
Yeah, but remember, this is not a war. Forget about the fact that we have the largest armada by the president's accounting that we've ever assembled there. Forget about the fact that we're firing missiles and dropping bombs and everything. This is not a war. Because if it were a war, of course, Congress would have to be informed. So there's a certain irony in the position. But here's what really worries me, Nicole. Apart from the fact that the Constitution says that the Congress should approve this, and I think most Americans would say, yeah, not super comfortable with the idea that any president gets to move the largest military around the globe without a debate in the Congress. But the other thing that is important here is that things tend to escalate, right? Now, I could paint for you a dozen scenarios where a bunch of bad guys in a motorboat full of explosives, take out a small U.S. Navy ship. Now, all of a sudden, are we in a real shooting war with Venezuela? What does that mean? These are all things that should be considered in the United States Congress and not just left up to the tender mercies of Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth. This is what the Constitution says. It's a very, very dangerous moment. I don't happen to believe, just to get right back to your question, I don't happen to believe that we're on the verge of an imminent invasion of Venezuela. But I do know that an experience shows that it is pretty easy to slide into something that you didn't intend to be in, you didn't intend to be in the first place.
What do you think the policy goal is? I mean, you're on the Intelligence Committee. Are they briefing the intelligence committees of warning? I mean, what are they doing in their heads? What do they think they're doing? Protecting America from what?
You raise a sore topic here, because no, they haven't briefed any, we have not heard from Tulsi Gabbard. We have not heard from the NSA and others that I assume are deeply involved in making sure that we're not taking out fishermen, making sure that we're not taking out, tourist boats and that. And by the way, I have some confidence, but we need that briefing. So here's what they're doing. They're doing two things. They're trying to make it look like they're doing something about drugs, right? This is performative. If you blow up a boat and you put it up on Twitter an hour later, you look like you're doing something about this, right? And I suppose you are. You're killing a bunch of guys on a boat. I'm not sure you're actually slowing this flow of cocaine into the United States in any real sense, but it is a performative exercise so that they can say, man, are we taking tough measures against these narco-terrorists? And number two, they're putting pressure on Venezuela, right? They sort of think that if you blow up a whole bunch of boats, that's going to be a huge problem for Maduro, right? Or if you stop these tankers, that's going to be a huge problem for Maduro. So I don't think they're deliberately going to use the military to affect regime change in Venezuela, but I think it would be a lovely, lovely byproduct for Marco Rubio and the president to have Maduro fall.
Let me read you what Susie Wiles said as part of the 11 on the record interviews she sat for with author and journalist Chris Whipple. Quote, "We're very sure we know who we're blowing up," she told me during lunch in November. "One of the great untold stories of the U.S. government is the talents of the CIA. And there may be an interest in going inside territorial waters, which we have permission to do because they're skirting the coastline to avoid getting caught." But Wiles conceded that attacking targets on Venezuela's mainland would force Trump to get congressional approval. If he were to authorize some activity on land, then it's war, and then we'd need Congress. But Marco and JD, to some extent, are up on the Hill every day briefing. So in Susie Wiles' mind, in the same interview, she concedes that she doesn't always prevail, but she says that the line for her is a land war. Is that what's been briefed to the intelligence committees?
I know it's not. And I guess the Susie Wiles theory of constitutional war-making authority is that if it happens on land, it's a war, but if it happens in the air or in the ocean, it's not. That would come as a huge surprise to people who fought in the Battle of Britain, which was an air war, or, the Pacific fights in World War II, Midway, this sort of thing, which were naval wars. No. Look, Susie Wiles is just plain wrong about this. We can have an argument about at what point it becomes a war, but when you have a good chunk of American combat power dropping all sorts of munitions, by the way, taking that combat power away from places like, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, taking it away from the Pacific Ocean where we have real concerns, I'm telling you, under the law, this is something that needs to be debated and approved by the United States Congress.
Let me just also bring our viewers up to speed with what Donald Trump has said about the blockade. He said, remember, they took all our energy, right, all our oil not that long ago, and we want it back. They illegally took it. Does that connect to anything that you've been briefed on that you know, is this about using, I mean, what is that about?
You know, it's funny, my Republican colleagues refuse to comment on Donald Trump's statements. You know, when he puts up something disgusting about Rob Reiner, oh, I didn't see that, I can't explain it. And so it's hard-pressed for me to explain what he means when he says the Venezuelans took our oil. What I can tell you for sure is that this activates some of the most intense anxieties that our allies in the region have. You know, over 150 years or over 200 years, the United States has sort of landed the Marines in various countries, has said, we're taking your oil and stuff. So what you're doing right here, when he says that, first of all, I can't explain it. It's their oil. We may agree that Maduro is a bad guy and an illegitimate president, but it's the Venezuelan people's oil. What you're doing is you're really causing every other leader, every other person in the region to say, oh, wait a minute, is this a throwback to the imperialism of the late 1800s? And, you know, whatever he's thinking, this is not helpful to our efforts in the region.
You mentioned Donald Trump's heinous statements about Rob Reiner in the early news cycle after it was known that he and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, had been murdered. It seems to have elicited something very rare on Capitol Hill, which is truthful disgust spoken publicly by Republicans about Donald Trump. Have you heard privately from your Republican colleagues?
Yeah. I mean, there's two reactions. I don't want to talk about it. I didn't see the tweet. I don't want to talk about it. It's really embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. And then there are those Republicans who will tell you, for some reason, this one's over the, outside the pale. And you know, the scary thing is, as a country, we used to believe that character mattered in our leaders. That the ability to see the world as something other than a reflection of yourself was sort of the definition of presidential leadership. And that Reiner quote may have sort of finally crystallized in people's minds that there's no tragedy so horrible that Donald Trump can't make it about Donald Trump, right? And this bleeds into how Americans are losing faith in his ability to steer the economy, right? When he calls affordability something that Americans are feeling every single day at the grocery store, at the gas pump, when he calls it a Democratic hoax, what he's doing is he's confirming this fear in the American mind that really it's all about Donald Trump and not about any of us.
He's giving a speech tonight, I guess. He says it's about the economy, but we haven't seen any of his advertised economic events stick too closely to the economy, which he's described, as you said, as a, quote, hoax. Are you girding yourself for any foreign policy pronouncements on Venezuela?
Probably not. I mean, how many presidential speeches have we seen in Trump version 1 and Trump version 2? I bet there'll be lots of talk about sleepy Joe Biden. There'll be lots of talk about radical, out-of-control Democrats. And there's not going to be. You can just tell. You can just tell by watching the man that his heart is not in affordability. You know, Donald Trump never struggled with the concept of affordability, right? He, you know, has gold-plated toilets and, you know, mansions in the sky in New York City and mansions in Mar-a-Lago. You know, he's never struggled with affordability, and he can't accept the possibility that maybe that's a challenge for an awful lot of Americans, which is, of course, why he got his clock cleaned in the last election, and why, if he can't change course, he's going to get his clock cleaned in the next.